At exactly 9:17 on a bright Monday morning, the most powerful woman in the company stood before 300 employees and proudly announced that the man everyone had called replaceable was finally gone. She smiled as applause filled the glass-walled auditorium, believing she had just removed the weakest link from her engineering division. But less than 6 hours later, the factory floor would fall silent, millions of dollars of equipment would become useless, and a room full of highly paid engineers would stare helplessly at a machine that only one person in the building had ever truly understood. That person was the single father she had fired. Before we begin, if you believe kindness deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this, and subscribe to our channel, Hardworking Dad. Your support helps us bring more stories about courage, family, humility, and the people who keep going even when nobody notices. The man at the center of the story was 41-year-old Calder Voss, a quiet mechanical engineer with tired eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, and dark brown hair that he usually pushed back with one hand whenever he was concentrating. He was not the kind of employee who demanded attention. He arrived early, left late, and kept a faded photograph of his 8-year-old daughter, Nori, taped inside his toolbox. Calder had worked at Meridian Robotics for 11 years, long enough to know every vibration, warning light, and strange metallic sound produced by the company's flagship assembly system. He had helped design the original machine when the company was still operating from a much smaller facility. Yet over the years, his contributions had become invisible because he never bragged about them. His life outside the factory was even more demanding. After losing his wife several years earlier, Calder had become both father and provider to Nori. Every morning, he prepared her breakfast before sunrise, checked that her school bag was packed, and drove her to school before heading to work. His daughter knew that money was tight, but Calder never allowed her to feel poor. He taught her that a small apartment could still be a home, that leftovers could become a special dinner, and that difficult days did not mean a difficult life. His greatest fear was not losing his job. It was failing the little girl who believed he could solve anything. Then Seraphina Vale, Meridian Robotics' newly appointed CEO, arrived. At 38, Seraphina had built a reputation for transforming struggling companies into highly profitable corporations. She was brilliant, disciplined, and relentless. She believed every problem had a measurable solution, and every employee could be replaced if the numbers demanded it. To her, Calder looked outdated. His clothes were simple, his methods were practical rather than fashionable, and he often questioned expensive software upgrades that her executives considered essential. Seraphina wanted younger engineers with impressive degrees, advanced terminology, and polished presentations. Calder believed machines cared little about titles or presentations. They cared about balance, pressure, timing, temperature, and the thousands of tiny details that could not always be seen on a computer screen. The conflict finally came during a Monday morning strategy meeting. Seraphina presented her restructuring plan and announced that Calder's position would be eliminated. She described the decision as modernization. Calder sat quietly while executives discussed replacing his responsibilities with a newly created engineering team. Nobody asked how many nights he had spent repairing the production system without claiming overtime. Nobody mentioned the emergency shutdown 3 winters earlier that could have cost the company millions. Nobody remembered that Calder had stayed inside the factory until midnight while everyone else had gone home. He simply thanked them for the opportunity and stood. His final walk through the engineering department was painfully ordinary. No dramatic farewell. No angry speech. Just a man carrying his old toolbox toward the elevator while coworkers avoided his eyes. In the parking lot, he placed the toolbox in his aging blue car, sat behind the steering wheel, and stared through the windshield for several minutes. Then he called Nori's school. He told them he would be there early. That afternoon, Seraphina celebrated the restructuring with her senior leadership team. She believed the company had finally moved beyond its dependence on one aging engineer. New systems were installed. New engineers were assigned. Calder's old workstation was cleared before sunset. But the next morning, the factory began producing defective components. At first, nobody panicked. The new engineering team adjusted the software. Then they recalibrated the sensors. They replaced several parts. Nothing worked. The machines continued producing pieces that were just slightly off specification. 1 millimeter here. A fraction of a degree there. Small errors that became enormous when multiplied across thousands of products. By Wednesday morning, production had stopped. Seraphina arrived at the factory under a clear afternoon sky, expecting a quick technical explanation. Instead, she found 12 engineers standing around the central assembly system, surrounded by open panels, diagnostic screens, tools, and scattered cables. The company's chief engineer admitted that they could not find the cause. Seraphina demanded an answer. They had none. One engineer finally suggested contacting Calder. Seraphina rejected the idea immediately. She reminded everyone that the company had moved forward and that bringing back the person they had replaced would undermine the entire restructuring. But another hour passed. Then another. The factory remained silent. Orders were delayed. Trucks sat waiting outside. Production managers began receiving angry calls from clients. The financial department estimated that every additional hour of downtime was costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Finally, Seraphina stood alone beside the machine Calder had helped build. She looked at the exposed mechanism and remembered something he had once said during a meeting: complicated machines often fail for simple reasons. She hated admitting it, but she needed him. Calder arrived the next morning wearing the same navy work jacket he had worn for years. He walked into the factory carrying his old toolbox. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The engineers simply moved aside. He did not criticize them. He did not say, "I told you so." He walked around the machine slowly, listening. That was the part that confused everyone. He did not immediately touch the computer. He placed one hand against the metal frame and waited. Then he asked the team to start the system. The machine began its cycle. Calder listened to the rhythm. A soft vibration. A pause. A metallic click. Another vibration. He crouched near the lower assembly and noticed a barely visible layer of dust around one of the mounting brackets. He opened his toolbox, pulled out a small measuring instrument, and checked the alignment. The problem was not the software. It was not the sensors. It was a tiny mechanical shift caused by a replacement component installed during the restructuring. The new part was technically correct. But it was not identical to the original. Calder explained that the machine had been designed around tolerances that the engineers had overlooked. The software could compensate for some changes, but not that one. Within an hour, the system was running again. The factory came alive. Machines moved. Conveyor belts rolled. Warning lights disappeared. Workers began cheering from the production floor. Seraphina stood several feet away, watching Calder tighten the final bolt. For the first time since becoming CEO, she looked less like an executive and more like a person confronting a painful truth. She had mistaken quietness for weakness. She had mistaken experience for outdated thinking. Most importantly, she had mistaken a human being for a line on a spreadsheet. After the factory returned to normal, Seraphina asked Calder to meet privately. He entered her office and placed his toolbox beside the door. She told him that she owed him an apology. Calder listened. She admitted that she had judged him by his appearance, his salary, his age, and the fact that he did not fight for recognition. She admitted that she had celebrated replacing him without ever asking what he had actually built. Calder did not demand his old position back. Instead, he told her that he had already found temporary work repairing industrial equipment. It paid less, but the schedule allowed him to spend more time with Nori. That answer surprised Seraphina. She asked him why he had helped the company after the way he had been treated. Calder simply explained that the people on the factory floor had families too. If he could prevent them from losing wages because of a mistake that he knew how to fix, he could not walk away. That sentence stayed with Seraphina long after he left. A week later, something unexpected happened. Seraphina changed the company's employee policy. Engineers were encouraged to document practical knowledge, experienced workers were given mentoring roles, and managers were required to understand the human impact of major staffing decisions. She also created a small engineering training program and offered Calder a consulting position with flexible hours. Calder accepted, but only after making one request: the company would sponsor scholarships for children of factory employees who could not afford advanced education. Seraphina agreed. Months later, Calder stood in the factory during another bright afternoon, watching a group of young engineers learn from technicians who had spent decades working with machines. Nori visited him that day after school, carrying a science project she had built from cardboard, wires, and a small motor. She proudly showed it to him. Calder smiled. He did not tell her that his career had almost disappeared. He did not tell her that the CEO who once considered him replaceable had eventually learned his value. He simply knelt beside his daughter and helped her fix the little machine. Across the factory, Seraphina watched them. She finally understood something no business course had ever taught her. The most valuable people in a company are not always the loudest, youngest, or most impressive on paper. Sometimes they are the exhausted father who arrives before everyone else. Sometimes they are the technician whose name never appears in a presentation. Sometimes they are the person who keeps fixing things quietly because people depend on them. And sometimes, the person you are most eager to replace is the person who built the very foundation you are standing on. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that their hard work matters, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who may need hope on a difficult day. And before we end, please comment, "Kindness is never wasted," if you believe that people deserve to be valued for more than what they can put on a resume. Because Calder never needed to prove that he was irreplaceable. He only needed someone to finally notice what he had been building all along. Not just a machine. Not just a career. But a life for his daughter, a future for his co-workers, and a quiet legacy built from thousands of ordinary acts of responsibility. And sometimes, that is the greatest thing a person can ever build.